Okay, everybody, if you all want to gather around for our opening keynote here. So we are live streaming this as well. So we've got Bill Morgan and Scott Kretchmar here to give us some history of IAPS and some tribute to Warren Fraleigh. I'm not going to talk much, so thank you both for coming here, being here today, and I'll let Bill kick things off here.
All right, thank you. Can you everybody hear me okay? Good? Okay. So I'm just going to do a brief historical overview of the founding of the society and the journal. And then Scott is going to follow up with various issues and challenges and talk a little bit about Warren. And then at the end, I want to come back and say a few remarks about Warren as well. So in terms of the history of the organization, as late as 1970, there was no formal scholarly organization devoted to the philosophy of sport, nor was there a journal devoted to philosophy of sport in this area. There were initial talks about the creation of such a society and journal in various national meetings in the late 1960s and early 70s. But perhaps the most important meeting in this regard was the Philosophy of Sport Conference that was hosted by SUNY Brockport in 1971. I was actually at this conference, but as many of you know, I'm a lot younger than Scott. I was an embryo when I first came to the first conference. The location in Brockport, of course, was no accident, as our beloved Warren Fraleigh was the dean of the College of Physical Education at this time. He had been hired away from San Jose State University. And Albert Brown, who was the president of the university, had proposed a new model for physical education that would be based on the humanities rather than the typical professional educational models. And he brought Warren to Brockport in 1970 to implement this vision. And an important part of Dean Fraleigh's transition to this new liberal arts model was he hired, and get this, 6 specialists in the philosophy of sport. That's 6. That has never been matched before or after. So they brought 6 specialists, and then they established philosophy of sport as one of the core subjects of the new curriculum. So this was quite a breakthrough and a radical departure from the past. Fraleigh and his cadre of new hires in sport philosophy, in particular, Fran Keenan, Scott Kretchmar, Carol Susswine, and Jenny Studer, began making plans to hold a philosophy of sport conference at Brockport in 1971. And an important part of that conference was to begin formal discussion on forming a new society and a journal. Now, they were ably assisted in this regard by the Center for Philosophical Exchange, headed by Howard Kiefer, who was the head of this and already had an established home at Brockport prior to Dean Fraleigh's arrival. The main mission of the center was to encourage philosophical inquiry focused on pressing social and public issues of the day, and then to disseminate the results of that inquiry to a greater academic and public community. And to meet this charge, the center annually hosted 2 renowned philosophers to speak to some timely and important issue. The sessions were conducted in a question and answer format. They were videotaped and then loaned out to various departments and educational institutions and public organizations at no cost. And when I say that these were renowned philosophers they invited, they were the top of their field. I recall watching a center video that featured a discussion of Alistair McIntyre and Charles Taylor. So again, at the top of their field. So Dean Fraleigh had asked Kiefer if he would be interested in bringing Paul Weiss to give a paper on sport, along with Richard Schott, who was at the time an up-and-coming philosophy professor from the University of Illinois, who was then to give a critical response to Weiss's paper. And the basic idea was then the Weiss-Schott interchange would be the keynote for the larger conference in 1971. And indeed, in 1971, Brockport hosted the first ever conference devoted to the philosophy of sport. As I mentioned, one of the aims of the conference was to initiate discussion on forming a new society and journal. and Dean Fraleigh had asked Bob Osterhout to make a formal proposal for both at the business meeting of the 1971 conference in order to gauge support for such an endeavor. The following year, in 1972, a steering committee was put together consisting of Paul Weiss, Richard Zahner, Warren Fraley, and Ellen Gerber. And they were charged with making recommendations about starting a new society and journal. In 1972, at a sport ethics symposium at Brockport, a formal proposal was made for the society by Paul Weiss. It was approved, and then in December 28th, 1972, at the Eastern District of the American Philosophical Association, the society was formally founded, and it was called the Philosophic Society for the Study of Sport, or PSSS. Paul Weiss was elected the first president of PSSS, Warren Fraley, the president-elect, Fran Keenan, the secretary-treasurer, and Michael Bouet, Scott Kretchmar, Hans Link, and Earl Ziegler as members at large. And the first full conference of the PSS took place again in Brockport in November 1st through 3rd in 1973. Now, the mission of PSS was, of course, to foster interchange and scholarship among those interested in the philosophy of sport. And from very beginning, the society was charged with being an international organization. And we certainly lived up to that promise. And Warren was a major force behind this international emphasis. After the society was established in short order, again under Dean Fraleigh's leadership and direction, initial steps were made to establish the Journal of the Philosophy of Sport. The original plan was for Paul Weiss to be the editor of the journal and for Bob Osterhout to serve as the Weiss's associate editor for 5 years, upon which then Osterhout would take over. But for reasons that I've not been able to get clear, Weiss withdrew from this arrangement, and that thrust the editorship into Osterhout's hands, at the time still a junior faculty member at the University of Minnesota. Of course, the loss of a senior, well-known philosopher like Weiss was quite a blow. The journal also had no budget to speak of to finance the new journal. That was partially resolved when Osterhout edited a collection in 1973 entitled The Philosophy of Sport, a collection of original essays, which mainly contained papers given at a Brockport conference and one in Windsor. The royalties of that publication yielded just over $1,200, and those were generously donated to the society for the purpose of establishing a new journal. There were significant obstacles to getting the journal off the ground besides the aforementioned budget constraints. For one, there was no associate editor nor business manager. For another, and obviously most concerning, there was no editorial review board. And so for all intents and purposes, the publication of the first issue of the Journal of Philosophy of Sport was a one-person production in which Osterhout recruited and made contractual arrangements with a printing firm, performed all of the manuscript preparation, edited and proofed all of the papers, and did all the correspondence with the authors, the executive board of the society, and members of the society and printer, and mailed all issues to members of the society, which is asking quite a bit of one person, to say the least. So it was a little surprised that when the first volume of the journal came out in 1974, as Osterhout himself put it, quote, it came to little other than a mimeographed proceedings of the Society's annual conference in 1973. So the slide you see there is the cover of the first issue. These slides were taken by Scott, so I appreciate that. And of course, when you, whoops. All right, why is this not working? Help, help, help. You don't know? It worked prior to the presentation, which is what always happens with technology. It's not a huge deal. We can't blow that. Let's see, it's not that one. Need to get that second one. As you can see, Osterhout wasn't exaggerating. This was the first page of the first essay in the journal. The publication of this first issue was also dependent on informal financial assistance he got from Brockport and the University of Minnesota. Fortunately, the publication of the second volume under Osterhout's editorship was much improved and better received, though still a long way from being a polished product. The improvement was due, no doubt, to the informal editorial review board Osterhout put together, and the fact that he had a newly installed business manager, Brian Fahey, from the University of New Mexico. The editorship of the journal then passed on to a senior faculty member, Harold Vanderswag from the University of Massachusetts in 1973, and Vanderswag served a 2-year term. And under his editorship, formal installation of an editorial review board, as well as the appointment of an associate editor, Klaus Meyer. The journal was also aided significantly by an improving financial picture in which funds from the Society's treasurer were used to defray costs. In 1975, the editorship of the journal was turned over to Klaus Meyer from the University of Western Ontario, and he held the position for an astonishingly 17 years. After his tenure, a number of other editors served on much shorter, formally stipulated terms. And suffice to say, after its hardly impressive debut, the journal has become the foremost publication of philosophy of sport worldwide, and surely the most important source of sophisticated and accomplished literature on the topic. So that's my brief historical overview, and now I turn it over to Scott.
Thank you, Bill. And as Bill mentioned, I'm going to be following with a discussion of some of the challenges that were faced during the early years of the Society. Bill gave us an excellent overview of the history of the International Association for the Philosophy of Sport, PSSS. We called ourselves the Pissers back in the old days. Not a particularly sophisticated or ennobling title, but that's what we called ourselves. I'm going to follow by highlighting 2 unique challenges faced by Warren Fraleigh and other founders of our organization. The first involved the marriage of 2 disciplines, philosophy and physical education. The second was related to the growth, diversification, and internationalization of our society. Challenge number 1, the marriage of 2 disciplines. As Professor Morgan's review of our history revealed, the founding of what was originally called the Philosophic Society for the Study of Sport was a joint venture requiring cooperation between 2 units in higher education that prior to the 1970s had relatively little to do with one another, either administratively or academically. Departments of physical education and philosophy existed for the most part in 2 different worlds. Physical education in the applied domain, producing gym teachers and coaches. And philosophy in the more theoretical realm, wrestling with some of the most fundamental questions of human existence. Consequently, when Fraleigh convened a group of physical educators and philosophers to discuss the founding, as Bill described, of a new international and interdisciplinary society, Fraleigh had to wonder if these two cultures had enough in common to make the project viable. Would the timing be right in the early 1970s for an interdisciplinary philosophy of sport organization to get off the ground? With the Center for Philosophic Exchange at Brockport and with Howard Kiefer willing to endorse and put money behind sport-related programs, and with a sizable philosophic faculty that Bill described in Warren's department, Fraleigh believed he had the sufficient number of puzzle pieces in place to move ahead in constructing the full picture. He understood, however, that there would be significant challenges. In this brief analysis that follows, I'm going to first attempt to underline constraints encountered in physical education on that side of the equation, and then in departments of philosophy. Unique challenges to physical education. We call ourselves kinesiology now because it's a much more sophisticated title. It sounds better. Prior to the 1970s, in institutions of higher education in the United States, nearly all philosophic work related to sport focused on teacher and coach training. Philosophic content was typically combined with historical information and offered in a combined course titled The History and Principles of Physical Education. The philosophic or principles elements tended to be either dogmatic in nature or wooden applications of schools of thought, such as realism, idealism, and pragmatism. Once again, both the principles and the applications were designed to help actual physical education teachers and coaches do their jobs effectively. The academic landscape changed dramatically in the mid-1960s when a gentleman named Franklin Henry, a professor of physical education at the University of California, this is a picture of him smoking on his pipe, he argued for a key distinction. And that distinction lay between physical education as a profession and sports studies as an academic discipline. Here was Henry's argument. He said that sport, games, dance, and other forms of skillful movement were worthy of academic attention in their own right. Departments of physical education, therefore, should not shape their curricula to fit the pedagogical needs any more than departments of literature, math, or art should assume their students would become teachers of those subjects. Henry's argument won the day in physical education. Physical education, eventually called kinesiology, began to separate professional preparation curricula for physical educators, athletic trainers, physical therapists, and any number of other vocations from disciplinary knowledge about human movement produced by the sciences, social sciences, and the humanities. It was on the heels of this emerging sea change in physical education that Warren Fraleigh was hired. As Bill noted, he was hired by the State University of New York forward-looking president, Albert Brown. Here's a picture of Mr. Brown. Fraleigh was charged with the development of a major in academic studies related to sport. One of the interesting sidelights is that Al Brown, the lower picture there, attended a conference here at Penn State when I was at Brockport, and he heard about this disciplinary split of the academic study of sport as opposed to the more professional things, professional kind of study. So he went back to Brockport excited about this new wave in physical education. He looked around the country for somebody to lead this, and Warren Fraleigh was the person that he found. This would be a formidable challenge. Let's see, Warren Fraleigh, as Bill noted, was hired at Brockport by forward-looking President Al Brown, and he was charged with developing this new program, a brand new program in sports studies. This would be a formidable challenge for Fraleigh because many scholars heretofore had been focused on vocational issues. and most of those with good disciplinary credentials had roots in the sciences, in biology, physiology of exercise, biomechanics, motor learning, motor control, and exercise psychology. Social science, and particularly humanities scholars, were few and far between. So where would Fraleigh find philosophers who would provide balance for his curriculum? Balance among the sciences, social sciences, and most importantly, given his own interests as a philosopher, the humanities. It turns out he found them by looking for newly minted PhDs, graduating, or in some cases about to graduate from several North American institutions, among them Ohio State, Illinois, the University of Southern California, and the University of Western Ontario. During the 1970s, Fraleigh hired 7. There were 6 on board at one time, as Bill mentioned, but during the whole 1970s, there were 7 sport philosophers hired by Dean Fraleigh. Several of them mentioned by Bill, but here's the total list of 7. Fran Keenan, Scott Kretchmar, Klaus Meyer, Bob Osterhout, Jenny Studer, Carol Susswein, and Carolyn Thomas. These new sport-trained kinesiologists had traveled a very unique academic road, and they encountered challenges that previous physical educators had not encountered in their own academic careers. I have 2 anecdotes that I would like to share with you. And as I mentioned earlier, when I gave my tribute to Warren, if any of you have heard any of these anecdotes before, I apologize. I published them in various places, but not in philosophy of sport journals. So hopefully none of you have heard these stories before. 2 stories. One of them has to do with my University of Southern California experiences. When I went to USC in 1966 to begin my doctoral program, I discovered that I had been pre-enrolled in a philosophy of education course taught by the Department of Education. I asked the head of the graduate program why I had been placed in this class. And he said everyone in the master's and doctoral programs took this course. It was tradition. I replied I wasn't interested in the philosophy of education and preferred to start with courses in the philosophy department itself. I would learn later I was attempting to cross time-honored boundaries. Fortunately, my request was supported by my 2 academic advisors, Eleanor Matheny and Howard Slesher. So I was permitted to enroll in mainline philosophy courses. I started by registering for a doctoral seminar on Martin Heidegger, of all people, taught by a phenomenologist, the late Dallas Willard. Prior to the first day of classes, Willard had seen my registration, and he noted I was coming from physical education. He stopped me at the doorway of the classroom. With a kindly but quizzical look on his face, he asked a very pointed question, and I remember it to this day verbatim. He asked, "What in the world are you doing over here?" I don't recall exactly what I said. I had to think quickly on my feet, but apparently it satisfied him, and he allowed me to stay in the class. And as things turned out, he became a very dear friend, and I took 2 more classes for him on Husserl and existential phenomenology. Anecdote number 2, I call it the breakfast experience. If a physical educator is something of an odd fellow in a doctoral level philosophy class, an erstwhile philosopher, like myself, was something of an odd fellow in physical education. This fact was brought home to me during my 2nd year of doctoral studies when I was invited to have breakfast with John Cooper. He was then president of our national organization, the Alliance for Health, Physical Education, Recreation, and Dance. The breakfast had been arranged by his niece, Sally Cooper, who was a fellow graduate student of mine at USC. Her uncle was a famous exercise physiologist, and needless to say, he was a prominent national figure. I was very much looking forward to the breakfast. After we sat down and after exchanging some niceties and ordering food and so forth, he finally got around to asking me the following question. What was I studying? I responded, I'm studying philosophy of sport. He did not seem impressed with that answer. So he proceeded with a follow-up question. What else are you studying? I hesitated for a second because I wasn't sure whether I should answer honestly or not. I said, I'm studying absolutely nothing else. He looked down at his scrambled eggs, which had just arrived, and he said, Kretchmar, you will never get a job. I had indigestion after that breakfast. Sport philosophers, it turns out, housed in kinesiology departments faced a double challenge in the 1970s, and in many cases, they still face those challenges today. We are at risk for this in the same way and for some of the same reasons that faculty in the humanities departments are at risk across our universities. But we are also at risk in different ways than professors in history, philosophy, and English departments. Sport philosophers have to fight for resources with colleagues within their own department. And sometimes these individuals within our own departments of kinesiology are biased against philosophy. I mention this to underline how unique Brockport was under Dean Fraleigh's leadership. There were 4 to 5 PhD trained sport philosophers, as far as I can tell, on the faculty at all times during his lengthy tenure at Brockport. To my knowledge, that has not existed anywhere else in the United States, as Bill mentioned, before or since, nor is it likely, in my judgment, to exist anywhere in the foreseeable future. I was very lucky to have been at Brockport when Dean Fraleigh was there, and then I was later blessed to be here at Penn State, because I had department heads, Carl Newell and Nancy Williams, who were very friendly to philosophy. And of course, we had support outside from members of the philosophy department and members of the Rock Ethics Institute. Such, however, is not the norm. The fact remains that many kinesiology departments, at least in the United States, and I would guess in other parts of the world as well, do not provide welcoming homes for sport philosophers, either the faculty or the programs. I move on now to challenges for sport philosophers who reside in philosophy departments. And maybe during the Q&A period, you can correct me or add to this, because I haven't lived in philosophy departments. I've lived on the other side of the street. But I think some things were fairly evident. Sport philosophy can be considered a form of applied philosophy in contrast to non-applied, or what some people roughly call pure philosophy. All forms of applied philosophy require an object to follow the verb. That is, something that answers the question, philosophy applied to what? Such applications in the 1970s had developed or were in the process of developing in such areas as the philosophy of law, the philosophy of religion, political philosophy, the philosophy of education, and the like. At the same time, however, it was difficult to fill in that blank with the term sport. Sport and sport ethics did not appear to carry the significance of other social issues such as euthanasia, eugenics, bans on contraception, moral duties to poorer nations, and other matters of social justice. The rub was highlighted in Stevenson's definition of philosophy, of applied philosophy. Here's what he wrote. Philosophy is applied if, and only if it is relevant to important questions of everyday life. Early sport philosophers residing in philosophy departments like Bernie Suits and Drew Hyland felt that sports satisfied both the relevance and the importance criteria identified by Stevenson. However, many of their colleagues and some philosophy department heads did not. However, in the 1970s, as changes were afoot in physical education, perspectives in philosophy were also evolving. A variety of social issues prompted philosophy to turn more in the direction of applied research and expand the number of topics that were deemed to be acceptable and merited attention. In the 70s and 80s, the rise of feminist studies helped philosophy shift to concrete social concerns. In addition, the rise of philosophy of popular culture as opposed to high culture increased. For example, philosophy of movies, of novels, attention given to television programs philosophically. These expanded the range of philosophic issues receiving attention. At the same time, the cultural visibility and importance of sport continued to increase. In short, it was becoming easier in philosophy units to fill in the applied to what blank space with the term sport. Even so, as the two stories I'm about to tell, progress was uneven and slow. Two more anecdotes. Let me get back to the first one. In 1971, as Bill mentioned, Brockport hosted the first Philosophy of Sport conference. Paul Weiss would be the keynote speaker. I was given the responsibility by Dean Fraleigh to talk with the philosophy department head, George Stack. It's a picture of George. I was to seek a co-sponsorship of this groundbreaking first Philosophy of Sport meeting. I went to Stack's office and I relayed the exciting plans that were afoot at that time. I said we would like the philosophy department to co-sponsor the event along with physical education. Stack shot a disdain glance in my direction and said, I quote, "Scott, there are absolutely no interesting questions in the philosophy of sport." They did not co-sponsor the conference. Anecdote number 2. It was 1978. The PSSS had been in existence for half a decade, and we were holding our 6th annual conference at Fort Worth, Texas, sponsored by Spencer Wirtz. I could not find a picture for Spencer anywhere. And so this is the book he wrote. Some of you may have used it. He was very much interested in literature and philosophy, and he put this anthology together. I used it for a number of years. Spencer was at TCU. We had a relatively small group present. In those early days, we sometimes attracted 15, 20 people, and we hoped this was at a school where whoever was hosting us could bring in a lot of students to sort of fill in the room, because there weren't many of us who were going to this. I think we had somewhere around 20 people down at TCU for this meeting. But the small group was a good mix of speakers from both philosophy and kinesiology departments. After an outstanding presentation by one of the parent discipline philosophers, who shall remain nameless, I went up to him and congratulated him on his talk. I asked if interest in the philosophy of sport was increasing in his own philosophy department. He said, quote, "My department head does not even know I'm here, and I won't be putting this presentation on my resume." I was taken aback. I put everything on my resume, when I walk my dog, whatever. Apparently, credit for work in the philosophy of sport was not readily doled out at least in some philosophy departments. I move on to the second challenge that Warren Fraleigh faced during the early years of the philosophy of sport. It had to do with growth, diversification, and internationalization. For some of you new members who know we are heavily internationalized now, it wasn't always the case, as I will tell you in just a second. The arrow that you see there points, well, it actually points below Rochester. That arrow is out a little bit, but it was in central western New York where Brockport was located, a little bit closer to the lake than what you see here. So the epicenter of sport philosophy in the 70s lay in a very small, relatively small geographical area, roughly within 300 miles of Brockport, New York. By conservative count, at least a third to half of all kinesiology-based sport philosophers in North America worked in the central to eastern parts of the United States and southeastern Canada. In addition, many philosophy-based members of our society, like Paul Weiss, Bernie Suits, Bob Simon, and Drew Hyland, Richard Zahner, they lived in this geographical region as well. So how would the philosophy of sport become national, let alone international organization? Fraleigh faced a dilemma. If the conference were held outside the northeastern part of the United States, attendance would likely be embarrassingly low. Let me go back here. I've got a slide out of order here. But if conferences remained within this geographical area, the growth of philosophy of sport would likely be curtailed. Fraleigh, it must be said, was always an advocate for geographical expansion and particularly for internationalization. He stood virtually alone in his willingness to err on the side of risking low attendance. Even so, as this slide shows, the first 5 PSS conferences were held in locations within 380 miles, an easy one-day drive of Brockport. In 1973, by Warren Fraleigh, here at Brockport, at Western Ontario, hosted by physical education philosopher Earl Ziegler. In 1975 at Penn State University, hosted by Becky Seidel. 1976 at Hartford, Connecticut, Trinity College, hosted by Drew Hyland. He was a very good basketball player at Princeton before he became a sport philosopher, got his PhD here at Penn State. And then the 5th conference that we held in 1977 was at Ohio State University, hosted by Cy Kleinman. It wasn't until 1980 and our 8th annual meeting of IAPS that we went overseas to Germany at the invitation of Hans Link in Karlsruhe, Germany. Of the first 10 meetings of our society, the Karlsruhe conference would be the only one held outside North America. But things changed very quickly. 3 of our next 6 meetings were held at international sites. In London, hosted by David Aspen. In Tsukuba, Japan, hosted by Akio Kataoka. And in Brighton, England, in conjunction with the 17th World Congress of Philosophy. Early involvement by members from the UK, Jim Perry and Peter Arnold, David Best, and a bit later, Mike McNamee, and from Norway by Gunnar Breivik during the early years, and then later by Sigmund Lowland, provided important support as we struggled to become a truly international organization. Special recognition, however, must also be given to sport philosophers from Japan. Warren Fraleigh had a special place in his heart for the Japanese contingent. Warren and I enjoyed rounds of golf, for instance, with Yoshi Kondo during those early years. Japanese members faithfully attended our meetings, and included, along with Professor Abe and Kataoka and Kondo, Professors Endo, Usakawa, Hata, Masamoto, Sakine, Takayuki, and Yamaguchi. The Japanese have hosted 4 of our conferences over the years. The most recent one, of course, in Kyoto, that a number of you attended at that beautiful venue in Japan. The names that I've highlighted here are individuals who have hosted one or more of our international meetings. This momentum toward internationalization only increased in recent years. Of the last 10 meetings of IAPS, 8 of them have taken place outside the United States. Look at this list. Rome, Italy, Porto, Portugal, Natal, Brazil, Cardiff, UK, Olympia, Greece, Whistler, Canada, Oslo, Norway, Kyoto, Japan. And next year, where are we going? Right? Split. So you can see the first 5 conferences within 360 miles of Brockport. 8 of the last 10, 9 of the last 11 conferences will be overseas. A similar pattern can be seen when observing and comparing the first 10 presidents of IAPS with the last 10 presidents. The first 10, Weiss, Fraleigh, Ziegler, Suits, Keenan, Binkley, Vanderswag, Highland, Lincoln, Kretchmar. 5 came from kinesiology, 5 from philosophy, 6 from the United States, 3 from Canada, 1 from Germany. And I hesitate to say 10 men and 0 women. This was our first 10 years. Take a look at our last 10 years. Presidents Boxell, Reed, Rosenberg, Torres, Jones, Ilundain, Agarosa, Weaving, Hardman, Sailors, Agerholm. 6 from kinesiology, 4 from philosophy, 5 from the United States, 2 from Canada, 2 from the UK, 1 from Norway. 6 men, 4 women. There's still a lot of work to be done in globalization, diversity, and gender equality. But IAPS, it appears, has been moving in the right direction. This was Warren Fraleigh's vision for our society. I wrote him about this very topic a month or so before he passed on. I reminded him how thoroughly international this movement had become, and it had strong representation from men and women and from different departments and colleges in our universities. Sandra, his wife, is pictured here and was in a previous picture this afternoon, wrote back because Warren was unable to correspond at that point. And she said, my letter pleased him greatly. Warren was pleased, I think, for a very clear reason, because he always believed that the tools of philosophy were invaluable if we were to become enlightened about the importance of sport, games, dance, and other physical activities, and the roles they played, the important roles they played in human flourishing. He pictured those of us, you and I, who would use those tools to be a diverse, inclusive, and most importantly, a collegial group of people. But I must say that behind it all for Fraleigh was something very fundamental. It was his love of sport. Fraleigh loved to play games. Many of my fondest memories of Warren come from the times we spent on the racquetball court and on the golf courses. In preparation for this talk, I went over to our library that contains our archives for IAPS, and I looked through those files over there. I saw a handwritten note by Warren addressed to me. He was complaining about an upcoming golf match I had organized with Bob Simon. I had assigned everyone a handicap. Warren, in his note, complained that his handicap number was too low. He wrote, and I quote from his letter to me, "As you know, my handicap is a stationary ball lying on the grass in front of me." That was Warren Fraleigh. Humble, playful, smart, very smart, forward-looking, full of integrity, courageous, a person to whom we all owe a great deal. I mentioned earlier this afternoon that I called him my surrogate father. I loved him. I'm going to miss him. All of us will miss him. Bill is going to add some comments.
Put it on upside down, Colleen.
I think you got it on there.
Is it on?
Sounds like it.
Yeah, it's on. So I just want to offer a couple comments. Many of you knew Warren. He was a wonderful man. He had a very good sense of humor. And a lot of you know that I have a pretty infantile sense of humor, and Warren put up with it. My wife puts up with it. As she puts it, it's a hard job, but somebody's got to do it. But Warren made the mistake once of coming to one of our conferences wearing a beret. And I immediately noted a striking resemblance to Foucault. And as a result, from that point on, I informally held a Foucault lookalike contest, which Warren won every year. And I reminded him of it, and he politely laughed at every time I did it, even though it was stupid and probably not very fun at any point. My other recollection of Warren was at the conference in Rochester. As you know, at that point, if you were there, Warren had some problems with respiration and was wearing oxygen. And it was a commemoration of some of the events, early events at Rockport. And during one of the presentations about the commemoration of the founding society of Rockport, I glanced at Warren, and he was quietly crying in the corner. No doubt, reliving some of his moments. Final thing I want to say about Warren is he was a great man. When I got the word of his passing, I don't mind telling you that I cried. And I don't mind telling you I love him. And we all owe him a great debt. So thank you for listening, and I guess we'll entertain any questions that people might have. But anyway, thank you.
You all have questions about you, the microphone too.
I'm not sure this is the kind of venue that you would have questions, but if you do, then we would certainly entertain them. If not, we can go ahead. Yes, please.
I think this was mentioned in
You need
Rochester.
a mic, they can't hear you without it.
Sorry, thanks. I think this was mentioned in Rochester, but I can't remember the explanation. But in the context right now, just what you brought up, the rebranding for boosters to IAPS. If you could talk a little bit about that, who initiated the rebranding, any other names that were proposed, and how was it eventually settled upon?
I don't recall who started the conversation, but I know Warren was involved in it. And the key change, other than the bad acronym PISRS, the key change was due to the word international. And Warren was absolutely driven by that idea. He wanted to go to Japan like the second or third year. And because most of us were assistant professors, not paid very well and starting families, we couldn't afford to go overseas. So his whole contingent of Rockport, if he'd gone over to Japan, wouldn't have been there. But Warren was driven by the internationalization, and I would guess he was behind it, but that was the key issue that I remember that drove the change.
Also, Simon Eason was involved, and Sigmund Luland from Norway, and I think there was some push that we should, emphasize international.
I'm sorry. If I may further this, I was in the archive 2 days ago, just going through it, and I was interested in the same question. I wanted to know when it started, who initiated it. So I found a document where in 1995, Warren Fraleigh is suggesting that they should go international. And he proposed the name International Society for Philosophy. So that was that, but then David Fairchild said that the name is unbecoming. I don't know why. That's what I wanted to ask.
Unbecoming, is that what you said?
Yeah,
Okay.
and it's in the document.
I have no recollection of that. Sorry, Martin.
Thank you so much for these wonderful tributes. I guess my question is, sometimes history is the best way to look for the future, see how to go forward. So based on all this stuff, I'd like to maybe share with us what you see are challenges and opportunities for the next generation of sport that you think might benefit from your asset.
Opportunities. I was born an optimist, a naive optimist. I think opportunities are increasing. My reading of higher education is that interdisciplinary and cross-disciplinary work is increasing. And it's increasing because no single discipline can answer the important questions. We have to work across our different methodologies to do it. I have a story I could tell very quickly. One of the physiology professors who was teaching a course here at Penn State on performance enhancement came into my office one day, and he rarely came into my office for any reason. But he sat in, he said, "Scott, I have a question for you." So I'm teaching this new class on physiology of performance enhancement. And all the students want to know is it ethical? Can you give me anything that I could read? I pointed to my bookshelf, that goes for miles. And I said, yeah, do you have about 10 years of take to read a lot of things that have been written about fair play and performance enhancement. So that's just a folksy story about it, but I think that story written large is dawning on more and more good scientists, good social scientists, and good humanities people. The humanities need biology as much as biology needs the humanities. I'm optimistic.
So I'm a pessimist, and when my life is going great, I'm just waiting to go around the corner and a bus hit me. So I'm less optimistic on the Keynes side. There's very few places you can get a PhD in philosophy of sport. Western, actually it's Western now, right? Not Western Ontario, and Penn State. However, I'm optimistic within philosophy departments. There's a lot more acceptance. So I know that when I was at University of Tennessee, actually 3 members of the philosophy department published something in the Journal of Philosophy of Sport, which is astounding. Because I remember when I was a PhD student in Minnesota and walking into Homer Mason's office, the head of the philosophy department, and wanted him to serve on my committee. He was a Kierkegaard scholar, and at that time I was just interested in Heidegger, and he just wouldn't do it, period. He just refused to do it. And when I talked to a lot of my philosophy professors in grad school and I mentioned what I was interested in, I'd get two responses. One is as if I said nothing and we just moved on to the next topic. The other was a sort of bemused smile cracked their face, and nothing followed from it. So I'm optimistic on the philosophy side, but sorry, I'm sorry, Scott. I don't know if I said that.
No, that's okay. You can't help yourself. No.
No, I can't.
I agree. I think more progress is made on the philosophy side. I could have mentioned that in my talk, but I see a bigger change there. Witness all the anthologies that we have out now, meaning there are courses being taught in philosophy departments now on philosophy of sport or sport ethics. That wasn't the case in 1972. So I think a lot of movement has occurred there. Part of the problem that we face in kinesiology is that we don't get large grants. And department heads and deans, where we're housed in large research universities like Penn State, are paid for getting the money from outside. And I think part of our absence in major universities is due to bias against philosophy, but part of it's due to just the way the game's played today. And it's difficult to get big money if you're a sport philosopher, but that's what professors at Penn State are supposed to do.
I can't thank you enough for this retrospective and this historical account.
Is that on? Is the mic on?
Oh. Hello? No, it's not.
Danny, just yell.
So I want to thank both of you for this retrospective and this important historical account that you presented here. I just had a question. If I'm not mistaken, the first woman to be president, because it was not in the range of years, was the late Joy DeSenza. And if you remember her contribution to the journal, she was, I think, the Society's bibliographer. And so I want to acknowledge her contribution, and she was a trailblazer among women in sport philosophy and in many other areas of sport management and women's studies. So I just wanted to make that acknowledgement.
No, touche. Well noted, Danny.
Agreed. She was a giant.
Wasn't Carolyn Thomas president at one time?
Carolyn Thomas was president. I'd have to look back at the list to see who was first, but Joy was among the first for sure, if not the first woman who was president of IAPS. It's on our website. If you want to go to the website, somebody could Google it now and check on that fact, but the list of presidents is there.
I think it's working now, right?
Yeah.
First of all, thank you so much. This is my first time at this conference, so it's helpful to learn about the history of the organization. I'm not sure if you know the answer to this question, or perhaps maybe some others do. The current picture of the association today is the case that the majority of the members have some kind of affiliation with the philosophy department, or is that not the case?
Boy, that is a tough one. I mean, I think it's pretty even at this point, if not more in philosophy, but I could be wrong. That's nothing more than a hunch. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, I'm not on the executive board, so I don't know what the most recent membership, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's moving more in the philosophy direction. I'm sorry, I don't have data on that, but
It's a very good question.
Hi, my name is Hi, my name is Rutaro Ichara, and I'm an Japanese international student. We'll be studying under Delta Groups at Cosmopolitan. And as a Japanese, I was wondering why in what aspect of Japan was Warren interested in? Like, why was he interested in Japan, and why all those like Japanese professors point IAPS activities?
All I know is that Warren's work was widely received in Japan. Other than that, Scott, you're the,
I'm not sure. I think he had visited Japan at some time during his life. He traveled quite a bit. But it was clear, partly because Japanese members were faithful. I mean, during those early years when we had 15, 20, 22 people at our meetings, there were 5 from Japan, year in, year out. And so their presence was very important for us early on. They were key supporters, and they've invited me and others over to give talks in Japan and so forth. And so there's been this two-way street. But I bet there's a deeper question about that connection between Warren and Sandra and Japan, because it was clear he was more interested in that connection than in some of the other world connections. But it would, I can give you Sandra Fraleigh's email, and you might email her and ask her that question. What was the connection?
Angie.
So it was Sandra and dance. I had a conversation once with the two of them in Japan when we were there.
Oh,
And it was on performance and dance. That was one of the reasons. I don't know if that's the only one,
okay.
but it was Sandra and dance and performance.
And Sandra Fraleigh, Warren's wife, was a professor of dance and a philosopher. She's written some very good philosophy. And the dance connection makes sense to me. She's very well known internationally in dance. So,
Want to get that stuff?
yep, I did. My wife's gonna kill me after this.
Was it spam or was it important?
Spam.
Now you're in real trouble.
I'm in real trouble.
That it? All right, well, thanks for listening. Appreciate it. Thank you. You know what? It was awesome.
Maybe, don't worry about it. I think they might have, hopefully,
I just went to shut it off and I noticed it wasn't.